Excuse me. There's a line.
I'm in a hurry. I don't have time for this.
We're all in a hurry. Go to the back.
Do you think you are telling me what to do?
That's not how it works. Wait your turn like everyone else.
You don't get to tell me what to do!
I'm not moving. You're next when the line moves. That's it.
The midday of January 26, 2025, found Lieutenant Detective Sharice Williams standing in line at Cornerstone Cafe, a popular coffee shop in the downtown financial district, waiting to order a sandwich and coffee during a brief lunch break from an investigation she had been conducting for 3 weeks. Sharice was wearing casual clothes, a teal-green blouse and jeans, with no visible indication she was a 17-year officer with the city police department, that she commanded the Special Crimes Unit, or that she had a record of commendations, including a Medal of Valor for performance during a shootout that had saved a fellow officer's life. To anyone looking, she was simply another customer waiting patiently for her turn. But when a woman behind her in line decided Sharice didn't belong in that cafe and began an altercation that quickly escalated to physical confrontation, security cameras captured every second of what would become a viral lesson about making assumptions based on appearances and consequences of allowing prejudice to guide actions. Sharice Williams had grown up in a working-class neighborhood on the city's east side, daughter of a nurse and a bus driver who had instilled in her both strong work ethic and commitment to justice. Sharice had excelled academically, despite attending under-resourced schools, earning a scholarship to State University, where she studied criminal justice while working part-time as a 911 dispatcher. After graduation, she joined the police department with idealistic vision of making a difference, of being the type of officer who treated everyone with dignity, regardless of background or appearances. The reality of policing had tested her idealism many times over the years, but she maintained her commitment to serving her community with integrity. During 17 years on the force, Sharice had worked her way from uniform patrol to homicide detective to special crimes. Unit commander, a position that came with responsibility for overseeing investigations of complex cases, including organized crime, large-scale fraud, and corruption. She was one of only 3 black women in command positions in the department of 450 officers, a reality that meant she often had to work twice as hard to receive half the recognition male white colleagues received. Sharice had developed thick skin over years of microaggressions and occasionally blatant discrimination within the department, learning to choose her battles carefully, while never compromising her standards or allowing unfair treatment to pass completely unchallenged. The woman standing behind Sharice in line at Cornerstone Cafe was Melissa Hartley, a 42-year-old white woman who worked as a senior marketing executive at an advertising firm located 3 blocks away. Melissa had grown up in an affluent suburb, daughter of a lawyer and a real estate agent, never having experienced significant discomfort or consequences for her behavior. She had moved to the city after college, building a successful career based partly on genuine talent, but also on networks and privilege she rarely acknowledged or questioned. Melissa was the type of person who saw herself as liberal, as an ally, but whose actions frequently contradicted her self-perception. Melissa had a history of treating people in service industries with condescension disguised as friendliness, of making comments that revealed assumptions about who belonged in certain spaces and who didn't. She never thought of herself as racist because she didn't use racial slurs and had a black colleague at work with whom she was friendly. But her implicit bias manifested in countless small ways, from the way she clutched her purse tighter when passing black men on the street to assumptions she made about people's competence and character based on their appearances. Melissa was exactly the type of person who would publicly proclaim she didn't see color while consistently treating people of color differently from white people. On the day Melissa walked into Cornerstone Cafe to grab coffee and a salad during her lunch break, she was already in a bad mood. She had just come from a meeting where a client had criticized a campaign her team had developed. Criticism Melissa felt was unfair, but that she couldn't defend against without risking losing the account. She was stressed about an approaching deadline, frustrated with a colleague she felt wasn't pulling their weight, and generally in a state of mind where she was looking for someone on whom to take out her frustrations. When she entered the cafe and saw a line of approximately 8 people waiting to order, her irritation intensified. Melissa stood in line directly behind Sharice, who was looking at the menu board while waiting, deciding between sandwich options. Cornerstone Cafe was an establishment Charisse visited occasionally when work brought her to this area of the city, but not frequently enough to have her order memorized. She was taking a moment to review her choices, completely normal and acceptable behavior for someone waiting in line at a busy cafe. But to Melissa, who was impatient and looking for a reason to be irritated, Charisse's pause while looking at the menu seemed unnecessarily slow. Melissa said loudly enough for Charisse to hear that some people needed to make decisions and not keep the line waiting. The comment was delivered with a tone of barely disguised irritation, clearly meant for Charisse to hear and feel pressured to hurry. Charisse heard the comment but chose to ignore it, having learned long ago that engaging with people making passive-aggressive comments in public often escalated situations unnecessarily. She continued looking at the menu for a few more seconds, then turned to the barista who had just called for the next person in line. Charisse moved forward to the counter and began placing her order with the barista, a young Asian woman named Jenny Chen, who had worked at Cornerstone Cafe for 2 years. Charisse ordered a turkey and Swiss cheese sandwich on rye bread with mustard and lettuce, no tomato, and a medium coffee with light cream. The order took approximately 20 seconds to articulate, perfectly normal time for a cafe transaction. But before Jenny could complete entering the order into the point-of-sale system, Melissa interrupted loudly, saying some people clearly had all day to waste while others had real jobs to get back to. The cafe room went slightly quieter as other customers noticed Melissa's tone and realized a confrontation was developing. Charisse turned to face Melissa, her expression calm but with slight tension around her eyes, suggesting she was keeping irritation under control. Charisse said politely she had placed her order as quickly as anyone else, that the line was moving at normal pace, and that everyone was waiting their turn patiently. Charisse's response was measured and reasonable, exactly the type of verbal de-escalation she had been trained to use both as an officer and simply as a person navigating the world professionally. But instead of acknowledging she had been rude or simply backing down, Melissa doubled down on her behavior. She said she didn't need attitude from Charisse, that Charisse should show more respect when in a nice establishment like this, that people like Charisse needed to learn their place. The phrase "people like you" hung in the air, its meaning perfectly clear to everyone in the room. Melissa hadn't used an explicit racial slur, but the implication was unmistakable. She was telling the black woman standing in front of her she didn't belong in a predominantly white middle-class cafe, that she should be grateful to be allowed there, that she should be deferential to white customers like Melissa. Charisse felt familiar anger rising, a mixture of personal frustration and professional outrage she had experienced countless times throughout her life. But she also recognized this was a situation that needed to be handled carefully. She was off duty, in casual clothes, not in an official capacity. Escalating to physical or even verbal confrontation would be counterproductive and potentially damaging to her reputation. So, Charisse took a deep breath and told Melissa calmly she wasn't going to engage with Melissa's rude comments, that she had placed her order and was going to pay for it and leave, and that she hoped Melissa's day improved. Charisse's response was a perfect example of taking the high road, of refusing to allow another person's behavior to drag her into a pointless argument. To any reasonable observer, it should have been the end of the interaction. Charisse had placed her order, refused to be baited, and was clearly trying to disengage. But Melissa, operating on a toxic mixture of stress, privilege, and racial bias, wasn't interested in disengaging. She was looking for a target for her frustrations, and she had decided Charisse would be that target. Melissa took a step forward, invading Charisse's personal space, and said Charisse wasn't going to turn her back on her, that Melissa was talking to her, that Charisse needed to listen when being addressed by her superior. The word superior was chosen deliberately, meant to establish hierarchy based on race rather than any actual metrics of position or achievement. Melissa was literally positioning herself as superior to Charisse based on nothing but skin color, behavior that was both absurd and offensive. Charisse turned back to face Melissa, her posture shifting slightly as she assessed the threat level. Melissa was now in her personal space, close enough that Charisse could smell her expensive perfume, close enough that a sudden movement could become physical contact. Charisse told Melissa with a voice that had taken on a firmer tone that Melissa needed to back up and give her space, that Melissa was making a scene over nothing, and that Charisse wasn't going to tolerate being spoken to this way. She didn't mention she was a police officer, still hoping the situation could be resolved without having to pull rank as authority. Jenny behind the counter had stopped processing Charisse's order and was watching the exchange with growing alarm. She had witnessed customer confrontations before, but there was something about Melissa's intensity and Charisse's tense calm that made this situation feel different, more dangerous. Jenny called for the manager, a middle-aged woman named Patricia Santos, who had been working in the back office. Patricia emerged and immediately assessed the situation, seeing Melissa standing too close to Charisse, both women clearly in conflict. Patricia approached and said she wasn't going to tolerate customers harassing each other, that if there was a problem she needed to hear about it calmly, or she would ask both parties to leave. Melissa immediately pivoted to Patricia, claiming Charisse had been rude to her, that Charisse had taken excessive time placing her order, that Charisse had given attitude when Melissa had politely pointed this out. All the claims were false or extremely exaggerated, but Melissa delivered them with the confidence of someone who was accustomed to being believed, especially when her word was against that of a black woman. Patricia looked from Melissa to Charisse, clearly trying to determine what had actually happened. She knew Charisse as an occasional customer who had always been polite, but she also knew the tendency in the service industry was to believe the customer complaining about another customer, particularly if the complaining customer was dressed more professionally and carrying herself with more authority. Melissa, in an expensive business suit with a designer purse, fit the profile of a valuable customer the establishment would want to keep happy. Charisse, in casual clothes, didn't carry the same external indicators of status Patricia could use to make judgments. But before Patricia could respond, another customer in line spoke up. A middle-aged man who had been standing 2 places behind Melissa said he had witnessed the entire exchange, that the woman in the suit had initiated the confrontation by making rude comments, that the woman in the green blouse had simply been trying to place her order and then had tried to de-escalate when confronted. His testimony was clear and direct, and was corroborated by multiple other customers who nodded or verbalized agreement. Melissa was visibly flustered by having her behavior called out publicly by a stranger. She said the man should mind his own business, that he hadn't heard everything that was said, that he was misinterpreting the situation. But as more customers indicated they agreed with the man's account, it became clear Melissa was being isolated as the aggressor in the situation. Unmoored. By losing control of the narrative she had tried to establish, Melissa made a choice that escalated the situation from verbal confrontation to physical assault. Melissa reached out and shoved Charisse's shoulder, not a hard push, but definite physical contact meant to intimidate or provoke. The moment was captured perfectly by the security camera mounted in the cafe's ceiling, footage clearly showing Melissa initiating physical contact while Charisse had kept her hands at her sides. Multiple customers gasped or took a step back, recognizing a line had been crossed. Touching someone in anger without consent during an argument wasn't simply rude, it was assault under law. Charisse's response to Melissa's shove was instantaneous and professional, a product of 17 years of training in controlling situations that had become physical. Charisse took a step back to create distance, her hands coming up in a defensive posture that was non-threatening but ready, her voice becoming firmer as she told Melissa not to touch her again. Charisse could feel adrenaline flowing through her system, her trained instincts assessing whether Melissa represented a real threat or if this was simply a person losing control of her emotions. Based on Melissa's body language and the context of the situation, Charisse determined Melissa probably wasn't preparing for serious violence, but that she also was clearly beyond the point of rational reasoning. Melissa, instead of backing down after pushing Charisse, seemed galvanized by the act of physical violence. She took a step forward again, finger pointing at Charisse's face, voice rising as she said Charisse wasn't going to tell her what to do, that Melissa was a paying customer, and Charisse was just another person who didn't know her place. Melissa reached out again, this time not just pushing, but trying to grab Charisse's blouse, apparently planning to pull Charisse closer or possibly shove her more vigorously. The movement was captured clearly on security camera, video evidence showing Melissa escalating from a single push to attempting to grab Charisse's clothing. Charisse reacted with precision, born of years of subject control training. She captured Melissa's wrist as Melissa reached for her blouse, used leverage and body positioning to spin Melissa around, and in less than 2 seconds had Melissa turned with Melissa's arm gently but firmly behind her back in a control hold that prevented Melissa from continuing aggression, but that didn't cause pain or injury. The entire sequence was executed so smoothly that multiple customers barely processed what had happened until they saw Melissa suddenly restrained, unable to move but clearly not being hurt. Charisse told Melissa with a voice that had taken on command authority that Melissa was being detained for assault, that Charisse was a lieutenant detective with the city police department, and that Melissa needed to stop resisting and calm down. The revelation that Charisse was a police officer ricocheted through the cafe like an electric shock. Customers who had been watching with a mixture of alarm and fascination suddenly understood why the woman who had been attacked had been able to respond so professionally. Patricia, the manager, immediately pulled out her phone to call 911. Realizing this had escalated beyond a customer dispute she could mediate internally. Melissa, finding herself suddenly restrained and facing the reality she had just assaulted a police officer, began trying to talk her way out of the situation. She said there was a misunderstanding, that she hadn't really touched Charisse, that if she had touched Charisse, it was an accident, that she hadn't known Charisse was a cop. Excuses and denials poured from Melissa in a stream of consciousness panic, each statement contradicting the last, as she desperately tried to avoid consequences of her actions. Charisse told Melissa calmly that everything was on video, that there were multiple witnesses, and that denying what had happened would only make the situation worse. Charisse maintained control of Melissa, but eased the pressure slightly once it became clear Melissa wasn't going to continue fighting. She could feel trembling in Melissa's arm as reality of the situation began sinking in. Charisse told Melissa she was going to keep her in this position until uniformed officers arrived, that if Melissa stayed calm and stopped trying to pull herself free, this didn't need to be more uncomfortable than it already was. Charisse then told Patricia and Jenny she needed them to preserve the security camera footage, that this would be critical evidence in the criminal case that would inevitably follow. Other customers in line had pulled out phones and begun recording the encounter once it became physical. Multiple video angles captured Melissa, pushing Charisse, trying to grab Charisse's clothing, and then being quickly restrained by Charisse. Footage also captured the verbal exchange that preceded the physical violence, with multiple phones recording audio of Melissa's comments about people like you and her superiority. The evidence being created in that moment would make it impossible for Melissa to later claim she had been the victim or that Charisse had been the aggressor. The man who had spoken up earlier in defense of Charisse approached carefully, identifying himself as Robert Chen, an attorney working at a firm 2 blocks away. Chen told Charisse he had witnessed the entire encounter from start to finish, that he was prepared to give a statement to responding officers, and that he had recorded portions of the confrontation on his phone. Charisse thanked Chen, appreciating that he had spoken up when many people would have simply stayed silent, not wanting to get involved. Chen said he had seen too many situations where people stood by while injustice happened, that he wasn't going to be a bystander when someone was clearly being harassed based on race. 2 uniformed officers from the district arrived approximately 6 minutes after Patricia had called 911. The officers were Officer Mark Stevens and Officer Keisha Brown, both with 5 years of experience and both familiar with Lieutenant Detective Williams by reputation, even if they didn't work directly with her. Stevens and Brown entered the cafe with hands-on belts near weapons but not drawn, assessing the scene as they entered. They saw Charisse holding a woman in business attire in a control position, multiple customers standing around watching with phones recording, and baristas behind the counter looking anxious. Stevens recognized Charisse immediately, despite her being in casual clothes. He approached carefully and said, "Lieutenant, what's the situation?" Charisse explained succinctly that she had been trying to place an order when the woman behind her in line had begun making racially charged comments, that the situation had escalated verbally, then that the woman had physically shoved her and tried to grab her clothing, that Charisse had restrained her using minimal necessary force, and that there were multiple witnesses, plus security camera footage documenting the entire encounter. Stevens nodded and said he would take custody of the subject, asking Charisse to transfer control of Melissa to him. Charisse released her hold on Melissa, and Stevens immediately took control of Melissa's arm, moving her into a position where Brown could apply handcuffs. Melissa began protesting immediately, saying this was ridiculous, that she was a senior executive at a respected firm, that she hadn't done anything to justify being arrested. Brown told Melissa she was being arrested for simple assault, that she had the right to remain silent, and began reciting Miranda warnings while securing the handcuffs. Melissa continued protesting even as her rights were being read to her, apparently unable to accept her actions had consequences. Stevens asked Charisse if she was injured or needed medical attention. Charisse said she was fine, that Melissa hadn't actually caused physical injury, but that the contact had been clearly non-consensual and aggressive. Stevens then began collecting contact information from witnesses, starting with Chen, who provided his business card and confirmed he had witnessed the entire encounter and was willing to testify if needed. Multiple other customers also came forward, providing names and phone numbers and volunteering that they had seen Melissa initiate both the verbal confrontation and the physical assault. Patricia, the cafe manager, took Stevens to the office to show him the security camera system. Footage showed a clear, well-lit angle of the ordering counter and line area, capturing the entire encounter from the moment Melissa made her first rude comment through the physical assault and eventual restraint by Charisse. Stevens immediately recognized the value of the footage and asked Patricia to preserve it, explaining it would be critical evidence in criminal proceedings. Patricia assured him the footage would be downloaded and saved in multiple locations, that she wouldn't allow it to be erased or recorded over. Brown completed the process of arresting Melissa, then escorted her to the patrol car waiting outside. As Melissa was being led through the cafe, she looked back at Charisse and said Charisse was going to regret this, that Melissa knew people, that she was going to make sure Charisse lost her badge. The threats were empty and born of desperation, but they were made in front of multiple witnesses and caught on witness video, adding possible witness intimidation to the charges Melissa was facing. Charisse didn't respond, simply watching as Melissa was led away, processing emotionally what had just occurred. After Melissa was removed from the cafe, Stevens asked Charisse to stay for a few minutes to give a preliminary statement. Charisse agreed, though she was eager to leave what had become a public scene. Stevens took detailed notes as Charisse described the sequence of events, starting with Melissa's initial comments through the physical assault. Charisse was careful to characterize her behavior as defensive and reactive rather than aggressive, emphasizing she had used only necessary force to prevent Melissa from continuing her attack. Stevens told Charisse that, based on security camera footage and multiple witness statements, the case against Melissa looked solid. He noted that Melissa's racially charged comments before the physical assault could potentially elevate charges to a hate crime, though that decision would be made by the district attorney's office. Stevens added he was sorry Charisse had to deal with this type of confrontation on her day off, that this was exactly the type of bias and aggression that made all officers work harder. After giving her statement, Charisse finally completed her original order, though her appetite had been largely destroyed by the confrontation. Jenny, the barista, insisted the sandwich and coffee were on the house, a small gesture of support Charisse appreciated. As Charisse was about to leave, Robert Chen approached again, saying he wanted to give his professional phone number in case Charisse needed witness attorney or support during any legal proceedings that followed. Chen said he had seen too many situations where victims of racially motivated assault didn't receive adequate support through the justice system, that he wanted to ensure Charisse had resources if needed. Charisse thanked Chen sincerely, touched by his willingness to get involved when many people would have simply watched and then forgotten about the incident. She gave Chen her business card and said she appreciated his position, that she probably wouldn't need his legal assistance given her own experience with the system, but that she was grateful for his support. Charisse then left the cafe, driving back to work to complete the investigation that had been interrupted by her lunch break, though she found it difficult to focus on her case after what had just occurred. Melissa was taken to the police district, where she was processed for simple assault. During processing, she continued claiming there was a misunderstanding, that she hadn't really attacked anyone, that this was a case of a black woman using her position as a cop to victimize an innocent white woman. The processing officer, a 20-year veteran named Sergeant Linda Martinez, listened to Melissa's claims with growing disbelief before informing Melissa there were multiple witnesses and security camera footage contradicting her account, that continuing to lie about what happened would only make her situation worse. Melissa was released on her own recognizance after approximately 4 hours in custody, with a court appearance date scheduled for 3 weeks later. When she left the station, she immediately called her husband Richard, a senior executive at an investment firm, explaining she had been arrested for a misunderstanding at a cafe. Richard was initially sympathetic until Melissa began describing events and he realized his wife had assaulted an off-duty police officer after making racially charged comments. Richard, who had seen many colleagues lose careers over public scandals, immediately recognized this could become a serious problem for their family. Meanwhile, witness video of the confrontation began circulating on social media within hours of the incident. Multiple customers who had recorded the encounter posted footage on platforms like Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok, with captions explaining that a privileged white woman had attacked an off-duty black police officer after making racist comments. Videos clearly showed Melissa pushing Charisse, trying to grab Charisse's clothing and then being professionally restrained. Audio captured Melissa's comments about people like you and claims of superiority. Witness videos of the confrontation went viral within 24 hours, accumulating millions of views across multiple social media platforms. Hashtags like Karen Attacks Cop and Justice for Charisse began trending as people shared footage and expressed outrage about Melissa's behavior. The clarity of video, unequivocally showing Melissa initiating both verbal harassment and physical assault, made it impossible for her defenders to create an alternative narrative. Comments on viral posts were overwhelmingly supportive of Charisse and condemnatory of Melissa, with many people noting this was a perfect example of white privilege and racism meeting consequences. Local media reporters quickly identified both Charisse and Melissa from videos. Within 2 days, multiple news stations had reported the story, identifying Melissa Hartley as a senior marketing executive at a mid-sized advertising firm called Brightpoint Marketing. News reporting included not just witness video, but also interviews with Robert Chen and other customers who had witnessed the confrontation. Chen gave an eloquent account of watching Melissa harass Charisse without provocation, emphasizing that Charisse had repeatedly tried to de-escalate the situation before Melissa made it physical. Brightpoint Marketing was immediately flooded with calls, emails, and social media posts from people demanding Melissa be fired. The company initially tried to avoid taking a position, releasing a vague statement saying they were aware of an incident involving an employee and that they were conducting an internal review. But as public pressure intensified and clients began threatening to terminate contracts if Melissa remained employed, company leadership recognized they had no choice but to act decisively. Melissa was placed on administrative leave while a human resources investigation was conducted. The HR investigation was more formality than genuine inquiry, given there was unquestionable video evidence of Melissa's behavior. Within a week, Brightpoint Marketing announced Melissa Hartley was no longer employed with the company. The statement cited behavior that wasn't aligned with company values and commitment to diversity, equity, and inclusion. Melissa's termination made additional news, with media reporting she had lost her six-figure position as a direct result of attacking an off-duty police officer after making racially charged comments. Melissa's job loss was only the beginning of consequences she faced. Friends and acquaintances began distancing themselves from her as the story became public, with multiple people posting on social media that they had cut ties with Melissa after learning about her behavior. The country club where Melissa and Richard were members conducted a membership review and quietly suggested the Hartley family might want to resign their membership, a clear implication they were no longer welcome. Parents at Melissa's children's school began avoiding her at school, events creating social isolation that extended beyond Melissa to her entire family. Richard, Melissa's husband, found his own career impacted by the scandal. His investment firm began receiving complaints from clients who didn't want to be associated with a company that employed the spouse of the viral Karen. Though Richard hadn't done anything wrong personally, the reality was that Melissa's public scandal was creating a public relations liability for his employer. Richard's senior partners had uncomfortable conversations with him about whether he might consider taking time away from the firm until media attention died down. Conversations Richard recognized were a prelude to asking him to resign if the situation didn't improve. The district attorney's office reviewed evidence in Melissa's case and decided to proceed with formal charges for simple assault. The prosecutor assigned to the case, a senior attorney named James Mitchell, who had prosecuted multiple hate crime cases, considered adding a hate crime enhancement to charges based on Melissa's racially motivated comments before the assault. After consulting with Charisse, who expressed she wanted focus to remain on the physical act of assault rather than racial motivation, Mitchell decided to proceed with straight assault charges, but preserve evidence of racial comments for sentencing consideration. Melissa's attorney, an experienced criminal defender named Douglas Brennan, found himself facing an almost impossible case to defend. Video evidence from multiple angles clearly showed his client pushing a police officer and trying to grab her clothing. Multiple witnesses corroborated that Melissa had initiated both verbal and physical confrontation. The officer herself had maintained professional composure and used only necessary force to protect herself. Brennan told Melissa frankly she had two choices: accept a plea deal or go to trial and almost certainly be convicted with a potentially more severe sentence. Melissa initially insisted she wanted to fight the charges, still clinging to belief she could convince a jury she had been misunderstood or provoked. Brennan explained brutally that no jury would sympathize with a wealthy white woman who attacked an off-duty black police officer after making racially charged comments. That social media video had already conditioned potential jurors to see Melissa as the villain, that going to trial would only result in greater public scrutiny and a harsher sentence. Under Brennan's reluctant advice and pressure from Richard, who was desperate to end the public scandal, Melissa agreed to consider a plea deal. Prosecutor Mitchell offered a plea deal requiring Melissa to plead guilty to simple assault in exchange for a recommended sentence of 6 months, suspended county jail time, 2 years probation, 200 hours of community service working with racial justice organizations, mandatory anger management counseling, and a permanent restraining order prohibiting Melissa from contacting Charisse. The deal also required Melissa to participate in a videotaped interview describing her actions and apologizing, video that would be used in training programs about racial bias and consequences of allowing prejudice to guide behavior. Mitchell made clear this was a generous offer given the severity of Melissa's behavior and public attention to the case, that if Melissa refused and went to trial, she would likely face actual jail time. Melissa took 3 weeks to accept the deal, a period during which she experienced continued social isolation, financial difficulties as savings depleted without her, income, and growing marital strain, as Richard blamed her for impacting their entire family. When Melissa finally agreed to accept the plea, she did so primarily to end the public scandal and allow her family to try moving forward. The plea hearing was held in a small courtroom with only a handful of observers, a marked contrast to the media attention the case had received. Melissa pleaded guilty with a barely audible voice, acknowledging she had assaulted Charisse Williams without justification. The judge presiding over the case, Judge Maria Rodriguez, accepted the plea but added stern comments before sentencing. Rodriguez said privilege and racial bias were serious problems in society, that people in positions of privilege needed to recognize how their actions impacted others, that physically attacking someone because you decided they didn't belong in a space was both criminally wrong and morally reprehensible. Rodriguez emphasized Charisse Williams had shown remarkable restraint and professionalism in responding to Melissa's assault, that many in Charisse's position would have reacted more severely, that Melissa should consider herself fortunate the officer she attacked had chosen the path of legal justice rather than retaliation. Rodriguez sentenced Melissa exactly per the plea agreement terms, but added a condition that Melissa complete a comprehensive diversity training program beyond other requirements. The judge specified that if Melissa failed to complete any terms of probation, the suspended jail sentence would be immediately activated and Melissa would serve the full 6 months in county jail. Rodriguez also ordered Melissa to pay restitution covering Charisse's lost wages for time spent dealing with the case plus legal expenses, a total of approximately $8,000. Charisse attended the sentencing hearing, but chose not to give a victim impact statement, feeling the video evidence and witness testimony spoke for itself. After the hearing, Charisse spoke briefly with reporters outside court, saying she was satisfied justice had been served, but that she hoped the case would serve as a reminder that racism and assault had consequences. Charisse emphasized she had experienced thousands of microaggressions throughout her career and life, that the confrontation with Melissa was simply one that had been captured on camera and resulted in accountability, that countless others in marginalized communities experience similar or worse treatment without having resources or evidence to pursue justice. Melissa's life after conviction remained difficult. She completed community service hours working at a community center in a predominantly black neighborhood, an experience that was deeply uncomfortable for her, but that potentially exposed her to perspectives she had never considered. Anger management counseling sessions forced Melissa to confront behavioral patterns she had developed over her lifetime, though therapists noted she often seemed more focused on avoiding future consequences than genuinely understanding why her actions had been wrong. Melissa's marriage to Richard deteriorated under the scandal's strain, with the couple eventually separating after 18 months. Finding new employment proved nearly impossible for Melissa. A Google search of her name immediately produced multiple articles about her attack on Charisse, along with the viral video. Potential employers consistently passed over her applications, not wanting the public relations risk of hiring the viral Karen. Melissa eventually accepted an administrative position, paying a fraction of her previous salary, at a small business whose owner hadn't heard about the scandal. The difference in professional responsibilities and financial compensation compared to her previous position was humiliating, but Melissa had little choice given her ruined reputation. Charisse returned to work after a brief break, focusing on her investigations and trying to move forward from the incident. But the confrontation had lasting impact. Charisse found herself more vigilant in public, more aware of how people looked at her, more tired of having to constantly prove her belonging in spaces. She began attending counseling sessions to process the trauma of being attacked and of seeing her life become social media content. Charisse spoke publicly about the experience on multiple occasions, using her platform to educate others about realities of everyday racism. Video of the confrontation became a training tool used in police academies and corporate diversity training programs across the country. Footage provided a clear example of how racial bias could escalate to violence, how professionally a trained officer responded to assault, and what consequences followed when people allowed prejudice to guide actions. Training program developed around the case included not just video, but interviews with Charisse, Chen, and other witnesses discussing the importance of speaking up against injustice when witnessed. 5 years after the incident, Charisse remained with the police department, having been promoted to captain, overseeing multiple specialized units. She maintained her position as an advocate for racial justice within the department and broader community. Melissa completed probation without violations, but remained largely socially ostracized, living more quietly and avoiding public attention. The viral video of their confrontation remained online as a permanent reminder of how a single moment of allowing privilege and racism to guide behavior could have lasting consequences.